Okay, we're going to be looking at today lesson 1. If you're looking at your textbook, we're on page 76. This is chapter 4, lesson 1. We're going to be reviewing it. So I want us to take a look at the PowerPoint. Play from the current slide. All right. So the first civilizations, we're on page 74. I'm sorry, 76. So the first civilizations were developed around 3000 BC. So if you flip back one page, we're looking at the map and you see this orange section, and this is where we're talking about, okay, the Fertile Crescent, this strip of land. So it says the first civilizations developed around 3000 BC. At the same time, Egypt, India, and China were also developing. The need for water and growing crops depended on where people settled. So they settled places where they could get those things, where they could grow crops well and where they had access to plenty of water. Mesopotamia was divided into social classes, and your social classes depended on your occupation. So the way early civilizations were alike were they had social classes. They had specialized work, like whether they were a weaver, a metal worker, a farmer, and their governments. The people of Mesopotamia set up governments to pass laws, defend their land, and to carry out building projects. So you're looking on page 76, the two rivers. Mesopotamia developed in southern Iraq today. Mesopotamia means the land between rivers, and we're going to talk about these two rivers. It's called the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and this civilization began on the plain between these two rivers. The Fertile Crescent is a curved shaped strip of farmland. It extends from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. And it's that picture that I was telling you about on page 74 and 75, that orange section, or in your map that we colored in class. So early valley dwellers. So before we get to this, these rivers ran parallel to one another, and this was very fertile farmland. This is what we're going to be talking about. So historians believe that Mesopotamia was the first settled around 7000 BC. The first settlers were hunters and herders. Around 4000 BC, some of these groups moved to the plain of the Tigris and the Euphrates Valley. They built farming villages along these rivers because it had good fertile farmland. So the thing is, though, these rivers, we're going to talk about them, and they had to learn how to control the rivers because they were unpredictable. So early farmers used the water from the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers to water their fields. The rivers were not always reliable because there was little to no rainfall in the summer. Rivers were often low, and farmers did not have enough water to plant crops in the fall if the river was low. But in the spring, the opposite happened. The rains and the melting snow from the northern mountains caused these rivers to overflow their banks, and it would flood their fields, and it could flood their homes and destroy their crops and their livestock. So this flooded plain was unexpected and violent, and floods were helpful, though, to farmers because these flooded rivers were filled with silt. And remember, silt is a vocabulary term, and it's the fine particles of fertile soil, and it would leave behind on the, in the fields, and it was good for farming, the silt was. So people learned to build dams and control the seasonal floods by they dug these canals that let water flow from the water source from the river into their fields. This is called irrigation. Irrigation allowed farmers to grow a surplus of food, which is also a vocabulary term. And it's when you have an extra amount of food. So not everyone had to farm now. So some people could become artisans or skilled workers, and they could have other jobs like specialized jobs in weaving cloth or making pottery and tools and weapons. People began to live in places that favored trade, so places that they could offer this. So if I didn't want to be a farmer, I could work in another specific specialized job, and I could trade with the farmer, and they could use my tools, and I could use their food, and they would live in areas that favored trade. Small farming villages ended up growing into cities. This is how cities formed. By 3000 BC, several cities had developed in southern Mesopotamia. The people of Sumer were known as Sumerians. They built the first cities in Southwest Asia, including these were the cities they developed, Uruk and Eridu, located in the lower part of the Tigris and the Euphrates river valleys. And if you look on page 78 at the bottom of the map, close to the Persian Gulf, you can see these 3 cities really close together. So city-states, we're on page 79. Sumer cities were surrounded by mud flats and patches of scorching desert. So it was really hot. This made it hard to travel by land and to communicate with other groups. So each city in Sumer became independent. They raised their own crops and made their own goods. Each city-state did. A city-state is a city that governs itself and its surrounded territory. The population of these cities ranged from 5,000 to 20,000 people. It is believed that city-states were protected with a large wall surrounding the city, made of mud from the rivers. Often these city-states went to war with one another over resources and political borders. They fought to win glory and to gain more territory. During times of peace, though, they would trade with one another, these cities that we've talked about. But a city-state is a city that governs itself. It doesn't rely on another larger government to oversee it. All right, we're on at the bottom of page 79. Polytheism. It's a belief in more than one god. And Sumerians were polytheistic people. The Sumerians thought that some gods had power over parts of nature, such as rain or wind. They also believed that some gods guided the things people did, such as plowing or brick making. They honored whatever god that would help their activity. Each city-state claimed their own god. And it says to honor the gods, they built large temples called a ziggurat. And you can see a ziggurat on page 80. And it's a pyramid-shaped structure with a large temple on top. And Sumerians claim that they received their power to rule from the city's god. Some of the first kings were most likely war heroes, and over time, their rule became hereditary, so their children, their sons, would become king. All right, so on page 80. Social groups. So we've talked about different social classes, and generally people remained in the social class that they were born into. Upper class were like kings, priests, warriors, and government officials that belonged to the upper class. The middle class were merchants and farmers, fishers, and artisans, and that was the largest group, the middle class. The lower class were enslaved people that were captured in war, and they usually worked for the upper class. The basic unit of society was family in Sumer. Men were the head of the home. Boys went to school, and they were trained under a specific job, normally what their father was. Sumerian women ran the home, and they taught their daughters to do the same and care for the children. Women had few civil rights. If you look on page 80, it also says that some women could own businesses. Sumerian laws required parents to care for their children, and the law also required adult children to care for their parents when their parents needed help. All right, page 81, farmers and traders. If you lived in Sumer, you were most likely a farmer. Each farm had a plot of land, dams, and waterways that ran through the land. Wheat, barley, and dates were the major crops that they grew. Farmers also raised sheep, goats, and pigs. Trade was another key part of Sumer's economy. They traded with India and Egypt. And remember, they lived near areas that encouraged trade. The Sumerians created the first civilization that had a great influence on history. Later civilizations copied this as far as city-states and social classes and specialized jobs. As a result, Mesopotamia has also been called the cradle of civilization. It was the beginning of an organized human society. Okay, writing. So we're at the bottom of page 81. Of the contributions made, and the Sumerians made many contributions to our world, but writing is probably perhaps the most important. Cuneiform is the earliest known writing system of the world. They kept records of their lives and history. They also used to share information. Cuneiform writing was made up of 1,200 different Cuneiform writing was made up of about 1,200 different characters. Characters represent names, physical objects, and numbers. Cuneiform was written by cutting wedge-shaped marks into damp clay with a sharp reed. Cuneiform comes from the Latin word wedge. Mostly boys from wealthy families learned to read and write cuneiform, and after years of training they could become a scribe, and a scribe was someone who wrote documents and recorded much of everyday life in Mesopotamia. and this is found on page 82. Some scribes, they kept court records, marriage contracts, business dealings, and important events. Some scribes were judges and government officials. Let's see. So the world's oldest written story is actually the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was written about 4,000 years ago, and I think we read that last week, or some of it, not all of it. And that is the world's oldest written story. And prior to that, Sumerians told their stories orally. That means they spoke it. And once they were able to come up with a form of writing called cuneiform, they were able to write these stories down. And the Epic of Gilgamesh is the world's oldest written story that we have. Technology and mathematics. Sumerians were the first people to use the wheel. I think we talked about the wheel a little bit in the last chapter, but they were the ones that developed it, or they were the first people to use it. And they built the first carts that were pulled by donkeys. They developed the chariot that was used in war. They used sailboats to travel. They invented a wooden plow and the potter's wheel to make pottery. They made bronze out of copper and tin. They studied math and astronomy. They used geometry to measure the size of fields to build buildings. They had a place value system of numbers based on 60, like 60 minutes and 60 seconds and 360-degree circle that we use today. They also studied when the best times to plant crops and to hold religious ceremonies. They came up with a 12-month calendar and the cycles of the moon. So they had a lot of contributions to the world that we still use today. That is all of lesson 1. So hopefully you've completed lesson 1 notes from chapter 4, and thank you for listening.